All right, if you would take your Bibles, please, and turn them to James chapter 5. James chapter 5, we're going to be looking at verses 7 through 11 this morning. James chapter 5, verses 7 through 11. You know, last week we looked at the first 6 verses of this particular chapter, and looking at that, and it was really a warning to this wealthy group of individuals. And one of the things that's one of the most surprising parts about that aspect was the fact it was written to a group of people that would probably honestly never read it. They would never read the fact that they were being judged, that they were going to be held accountable for what they were doing, that they were ultimately condemned. This morning we need to look at those who are actually suffering under the wrath here of the wealthy, if you will. The wealth that they have, it might be consuming them, as we talked about last week, kind of from the inside out. But these poor, specifically Christians, these brothers and sisters in Christ, are the ones that are actually feeling the corrosive effects of that wealth. He said the wealthy are going through that, and they are condemned, and it is eating their soul, so to speak, from the inside. But by and large, they have no idea. They don't appreciate this fact. They're not even aware that this is going on. It's just simply something that James is telling them is ultimately happening because of the direction and the choices that they are making. But it's the poor, and it's the people that are underneath of them that feel those dire effects. And the question that comes up here as that goes on is, how do you respond to that? We talked a little bit last week about the fact that we would try to answer the question, how long, O Lord, and why? And here's a group of people that are asking those very same questions. How long do we have to suffer this? Why are we suffering this way? And James's response this morning is going to be one of what's the right word for it? Difficulty, if nothing else, because he's saying, be patient. How do you live patiently in a world that's gone mad? That's ultimately what he's telling them. Be patient. And they're like, how are we supposed to do this? And we're going to find some examples of individuals who have done those very things. And the lesson they learned, and I think the lesson that we need to learn, is that we cannot charge and should not charge God with wrong, but instead wait patiently for his return. Ultimately, what we'll find at the end is that's what Job did. So let's do some reading this morning. James chapter 5, we're just going to read verses 7 through 9 this morning. It says this, be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. One of the things we're going to find right away here is the first thing that needs to happen is we need to be finding the right attitude. Finding the right attitude. And as I said, we kind of broached the subject of how long, O Lord, last week. And I talked about the fact that we were going to look into it a little bit further this morning. And indeed we are. How long, O Lord? And related to that question ultimately is why. Because one of the first questions you might ask is, why is this happening to me? And then shortly related to that is, like, how long do I have to go through this? We don't always get the why question, especially, and we understand that part, but I think it's related. But beyond that, it's like, okay, I might not understand why these are happening, but how long does this have to be a part of my life? How long? On its face, I think sometimes we ask the idea of why and think if we could hear an answer, it would justify everything that was going on there. I don't know if it would. I mean, it does justify it in the eyes of God, but I don't know if we would actually dignify God's answer with a positive response. Like, it's not worth it. We would downplay that. We would say, that's not important. I don't need that. But most of the time, the answers to the questions that we ask, they're not obvious. And the fact is that because they're not obvious, we assume that there aren't any. I've given you this illustration before. I'm not going to repeat it longingly over. You can look it up easily or ask me after. But Alvin Plantinga, a well-known philosopher, talked about these things like the pup in the tent and the no-see-ums in the tent and those kinds of things. It just basically says, just because you can't see something doesn't mean it's not there. It just means you can't see it. God has his reasons. And God has his duration. Does it mean that you're going to understand that fully even here and now or eventually on this earth? No. But God does, in fact, have his reasons. And just because you can't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means you can't see it. when Israel was in slavery in Egypt, they were crying out. They were crying out to God to do something. I'm sure part of those cries were why, and part of that was like, how much longer do we have to endure this? And we come across a verse very quickly in Exodus. It's Exodus 2:23. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help, and their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. That was right before Moses came on the scene and the 10 plagues began and delivered the children of Israel from the hands of Egypt. They've been crying for a long time, but you remember how Moses was born. We kind of got to experience this, or be reminded of it, I guess, again, in some ways, and I would commend it to you, the Sight and Sound, if you're familiar with that organization, that group. Over this weekend, right now, they did a live performance of their Moses play, and it's kind of a pay what you want for the weekend. And so it was live on Friday night, and then over this weekend, you can kind of replay it however you want to. So if it's something you'd be interested in, it's about 2 hours. Very well done. If you've never seen one or experienced one, you'd really enjoy it. But you can find that online if you want to look it up. But, watching that, and one of the things they brought up there, and is reminding of the fact that it's not just Moses' deliverance that's this miracle. Like, you can rewind Moses' life and remember that he's pulled up out of the Nile, out of this reed basket. And when you think about how old Moses is when he comes back onto the scene, back into Egypt to deliver the children of Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, like, it's been 80 years. Like, Moses is born in a period of time when the Egyptians were already very, very hostile towards the Israelites. Probably very many of them were already enslaved and doing things, and certainly they were slaughtering these male children from the get-go. So for at least 80 years, the children of Israel have been experiencing this oppression at the hands of the Egyptians, that almost everybody that's alive, if not everyone that's alive at this moment in time, as Moses goes back to deliver the people of Egypt, had known nothing other than these experiences. They had only ever known slavery. They had only known what it means to be deprived of basic human rights and needs and food and freedom. They don't know anything else. They've been crying out to God to deliver them for decades. And what do they get? Nothing. How long, oh Lord, must we live like this? And this wasn't some minor inconvenience of life. It is literally killing them. The entire nation inside of Egypt is literally killing them. And the poor treatment, and I can only imagine how many ailments and how many scars and how many bruises and how many broken limbs and joints and everything else that they are suffering at the hands of the Egyptians. And they cry out day after day, how long, oh Lord, does this have to be a part of my life? Nothing. They get nothing. And they kept crying. They kept crying. Why? How long? Aren't those always the questions that we start to ask? Maybe even, God, are you even there? 2 Corinthians helps us a little. 4:17 says, for this light, momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Now that might sound cruel, to call what the Israelites were going through light, momentary affliction. But keep in mind, the Apostle Paul, who writes this, had his own fair share of terrible experiences. And he still calls them light, momentary afflictions. But what he is also saying is they're not meaningless. That they're doing something. Can you imagine if you were in control of your own trials? Like if you had, one of these, pause, fast forward, rewind, skip. Skip would be a popular one, I think. We would do that. We would control that. It's like, ooh, this hurts. Fast forward a few minutes. Let's see what we get next. We would do that. But what would we learn? What would we learn? We would never want to feel pain. We would try to insulate ourselves so that even the slightest pick or prod would cause us to reach over, grab the remote, and fast forward. I don't want to experience that. That's hard. That's painful. The problem is we would never grow as Christians. We would never have to mature. We would never have to do the hard thing. We would never have to make the hard choices. We would never learn to really and truly and fully depend upon God to get us through. And we would never appreciate what it means to go and live life by God's grace. We would only know what it means to do life by God, by this remote. And how I can protect myself. There's a toughness that comes about people when they've gone through trials and tribulations and suffering. There's a toughness that develops that a lot like a callus. You've seen some of these, especially old timers, where they've lived a hard life, they've done a lot of hard work, and their hands are like impenetrable. And you see them sometimes, and you go to help them and do something, and there they are. They look frail on the outside. They start working, and you're like, "Ow, this hurts," and they're like, What's wrong with you? And you look at their hands, and there's like the calluses are like an inch thick. You're like, nothing could get through that. And then once in a while, you'll see them, you're working with wood or doing something like that, and you realize there's a splinter hanging, and it's like a stick. It's hanging out of their hand, like, oh, look at that. And they just toss it aside like it's no big deal. And you've been helping them for a little bit, and your little soft dishwasher kind of hands are there, and they're covered in blisters, and they're all popped and broken, and you're like, ow. And they're like, what is the matter with you? You're doing the same work. What happened? They got tough. Not bitter, but they got tough. And they learned how to do this, and they grew, and they developed, and they matured, and they're able to do things and trust God in ways that you haven't learned yet. But most of the time you ask them, how did you get like this? It wasn't by taking the easy path. They learned, and it's through trial. Why did it take so long? Because this took that long. These calluses took that long. But look at what God has done because of it. I think when somebody is going through this, or even yourself, there's another level where you have to say, like how long or why. And the generic answer, but the right answer is I don't know. I think that has to be a part of your answer and one of those things that is in your toolbox. However, coupled with that, and I think you do need to give them together, is this idea that just because you are suffering, just because you're going through trial and tribulation and difficulty, it does not mean that God does not love you. It doesn't mean that. We can assume that sometimes, or we can struggle with that and think, oh, God doesn't love me. It's not a measure of God's love or lack thereof for you. God loved his Son, yet did not spare him from suffering. In fact, Christ suffered terribly, and Christ suffered greatly on the cross, and during his lifetime here, rejected by so many people. You think about what it's like when you go to work, or you go to your family, or people that you know, or your neighbors, whoever, and they reject you, they don't like you, they yell at you. You don't love that. You don't like that. And here's Christ walking around. The Pharisees, they want nothing to do with him. There were various people that he would come to, even his hometown. He's out there, and he's doing his thing, and he goes in there, and he can't perform but more than a handful of miracles because they don't believe. They reject him. You don't like that. Don't tell me he did. But God still loved him as his Son, yet did not spare him from suffering. Suffering is not a measure of God's love. What we do know also for sure is this: that God will fully and finally end, suffering will finally and fully end at the Lord's return. It might end before that, but finally and fully, we have this promise that there is an ending point no matter what. And until that moment, we need to be patient, which is exactly what he says here in verse 7. Be patient, therefore, brothers. Verses 1 through 6, James had been talking about these wicked rich that are clearly outside of the church, but now he's addressing brothers, and we can add sisters, in Christ. They're not the wealthy, they are the poor, they are the oppressed. But again, this statement is less than helpful. I'm sure you can remember whether you yourself were the receiver of this or you yourself have done this, but when your kids come up to you and they ask you, you've just sat down and you're enjoying something or you're immersed in something, and they say, hey, Mom, hey, Dad, can you get up and get me a drink, snack, whatever? And you're like, oh, I just sat down. Give me a minute, which every kid knows his parents speak for like half an hour at least, right? And you're like, I want it now. We hate that. We hate that. But eventually, you'll get up and you'll do that. But the problem is, like, we don't want to be patient. And most of the time, we can, in fact, afford to wait. But we live in an instant gratification society where waiting is now like this concept of, like, what is that? That's too old-fashioned. We sit at the microwave and we yell at it, hurry up, let's go. I don't want to wait. I want it now. We complain because Amazon's 2-day shipping takes 3 days. It wasn't that long ago when you ordered something, it was like, 7 to 10 business days. It was like, oh my word. Now, like Garrett told me, Hangen told me the other day, he ordered a book. I think he had it either the next day or the same day. And I'm like, come on. We're an instant gratification society. We don't know what it means to wait anymore. We don't know what it means to be patient. And then here's James, be patient. He's probably smiling when he says it, I think, probably at least to be nice. Oh, we hate that. And I'm sure the people that are listening to this at some level are like, okay, I understand what you're saying, but it's hard. And you can spit, cuss, and kick, and whatever else you want to, all the same. It won't change things. And he gives us the illustration of a farmer. Farmers understand this, probably more so than anybody else. The farmer knows this. If he wants to eat tomorrow, he has to plant today. That's important. And he has to do this on a repetitive, cyclical kind of a basis. You have to always do this. And yet the farmer cannot go out and just do whatever he wants and make it happen as fast as he wants. It requires patience. It's starting to get close to the time where we can start thinking about spring. Right? You know what Clark is not going to do this afternoon? Plant corn. Beyond the whole soggy fields or whatever else, he'd probably never get out there. But even if he could get the kernels of corn in the ground, my guess is they would rot long before they would ever sprout. Like he can say, hey, I want to hurry up. I want to be able to harvest and do stuff. I don't know if July would be enough time from now, but maybe close. If he could plant like today, tomorrow, it'd be great. I can't. You're limited. You have to plant according to how the calendar goes. Here we see in our passage, even as it says in verse 7, the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until he receives the early and the late rains. So the early rains would have been for them in the late fall. He's got to wait until those things are coming. He can plant, but he has to wait for those rains to start there, and then he can harvest after the late rains in the early spring. He's got to wait for his growing season to finish up, and once finally those last of those late rains are done, and you realize, like, that's it. That's what they're going to get. We can actually harvest this now, but he's bound by the laws of nature that God has put in place, and there's nothing he can do about it. He can't change that. It would be nice if he could plant whenever he wanted to, harvest whenever he could. You can go out there and you plant your grain out there, and then you put your corn in the ground, and you're looking at it like start to just see it starting to sprout a little bit, and then just go out there. I can see Nicholas doing this and just like screaming at, hurry up! I don't think Nicholas would ever do that, but some or later it starts to grow up a little bit, and it's like, okay, it looks promising, but you know what? The weather, the Farmer's Almanac is telling us it's going to be colder. It's going to get cold early this year, and going out there and grab your corn by the ears and say, come on, and pull it up. It'd be nice if you could do that. It doesn't change anything. I asked an expert, I went next door to the other guy's office, Pastor Daniel, said, okay, as a farm kid, can you tell me, if you buy 90-day corn, for example, is there really anything that you can do to get 90-day corn ready in, 75 days? I mean, not that maybe it was practical or anything else like that, but is there something you can do? And he goes, not that I know of. There's probably things you could do to slow it down, starve it and a drought and other kinds of things like that. But to really make it faster, not really. Not really. See, even 2,000 years later, we're still bound by the same laws that they are. We really can't do anything. A farmer has to be patient. And it's that same kind of a patience that we need to apply in our own lives as we're waiting for this kind of thing. How long, O Lord? As long as it takes. And then he goes on. Establish your hearts, he says, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Really, to do this, you have to establish or fortify your hearts. It reminded me of the phrase that comes in Shakespeare's Macbeth. This is, screw your courage to the sticking place. that actually comes up. The reason most of you maybe have heard that before, maybe from school, but also in Beauty and the Beast is where it's one of the lines in the song that they sing. But screw your courage to the sticking place. From what I can tell, it's a reference to the cocking of a crossbow. Pulling that string back on that crossbow until it gets all the way and it can actually get in that catch where it's like it would be cocked, if you will. If you get that bowstring back and you pull it even 3/4 of the way there and then let go, it's not going to stay there. You've got to get it all the way back or it's not useful. You have to fortify your heart. You have to look at these things and make choices or you'll lose your patience. Which means like the way in which we approach sin, the way in which we approach the patience even in the trial and the durations of which we are going through here. It goes, look, I have to be in this for the long haul because if I get partway in and I give up, I'm going to lose my patience. I'm not going to be able to keep this together. I'm not going to be able to wait the way that I need to wait. It's hard. It is hard, and it's not the kind of thing that we like to do or enjoy doing. But again, we look at this passage and say, wait a minute, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. And then you go back down to verse 9 a little bit further, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door, talking about Christ and his return. And you realize like the imminency of that return that he's talking about here. And you wonder like, wait a minute, where is he? You talk about the fact that he's ready to walk out the door. He's nowhere to be found, nowhere to be seen. What's going on? 2,000 years and we're still waiting. Where are you, Lord? D.A. Carson called this one of the most controversial passages in the New Testament for this reason. I mean, at the end of the day, we realize the length of this time, this duration, is unknown. Mark 13:32 is a verse that's here. I'll read it for you in a moment. But we actually had I was Jehovah's Witness many, many years ago, come and visit Pastor Love and I at church. And this is one of the verses that he used to disprove the deity of Christ. See, Christ doesn't know everything. Look, but concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven or the Son, but only the Father. See, the Son doesn't know. Therefore, he's not God. Completely misunderstanding the reality of what it means to be the God-man. But that's how he used this idea here. But here, clearly we find Jesus says, not even the Son knows this return. And yet we also can understand that it is imminent. Just as much as it is today, it was then. I think the thing that maybe helps the most here is thinking about this. We watched some of the Olympics that was going on recently. And a lot of those skiing events, those downhill events and slaloms and everything else that they were doing, there's that starting gate. You know that? And you've got the little sticks that come across and you see the athletes lining up there and then, kind of shoot themselves down there. But the cameras would often be at the bottom of the hill kind of looking up, and you'd see the contestant or the athlete that was up there and just kind of like milling about doing his thing. He's kind of, for all intents and purposes, standing at the door, standing at the gate. But when will he descend? Or she? When will they descend? It's not something you can set your clock by because there's all kinds of factors that come into play there. We realize it depends on how fast the previous skier was. Depends on whether there was an accident, whether or not the track was damaged, whether or not the coach is ready, or if they're having an equipment malfunction, or there's last-minute instructions that he wants to give, or some adjustments, or maybe the judges aren't ready. There's all kinds of things that have to be into place before they're actually able to come down. And even then, when that person gets set there, they have a little bit of a wiggle room when they go through those gates. Their descent down the course is imminent. But you can't set your clock by it. And here we are looking at Christ, and really, there's nothing blocking him from coming at this time, nor was there really then either. But at the same time, we can recognize, but it's imminent, it's coming, it's soon. It feels like every day that we look around the world, we see it's got to be sooner, it's got to be closer. Indeed, I think it is. But there are many attitudes as we look at this passage that we could possibly have when it comes to suffering and asking questions like, why or how long, O Lord? But what James says, rather than knowing the answer to those questions specifically, the attitude that we are to have is one of patience as we wait. It takes as long as it takes. But what does that really look like? Because let's be honest, the farmer is probably not waiting in agony. Maybe sometimes he is, but usually not. Probably not waiting in agony, not waiting in pain. It's different. We have the right attitude, but we need also the right example. Where can we find that? James 10 and 11 tell us. Finding the right example. Verses 10 through 11. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You've heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you've seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. We start here really with these steadfast prophets. That's what he talks about them here, these steadfast prophets, these patient prophets. And we can be thankful for good examples like them that we have. But these may not be the ones that you want. But you start thinking about the way that Israel always treated its prophets, and it was not a glamorous job. It was a dangerous job, a very dangerous job to have. And Israel had a long history, a very long history of slaughtering and killing its prophets in all kinds of various means. Even though it wasn't around at the time, we can look at the book of Hebrews to be able to consider some of the fate that these prophets experienced over the course of their lives. And here in Hebrews 11, 36 and 38, it says this, others suffered mocking and flogging, even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned and they were sawn in two. They were killed with a sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, and mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and in caves of the earth. There are some positive things that are mentioned previous to the verses that we read. Well, you look at this and you realize there's a lot of negative too. We realize that Elisha was mocked more than once. Isaiah is the one that is more than likely being referred to. Tradition has him hiding in a tree, them finding him in there and sawing the tree down in half while he was still inside. Micaiah is one who was put in chains because he was brought before Ahab and challenged to give him a favorable word, so to speak. And Micaiah does, and Ahab is so familiar with Micaiah, he realizes that you're lying, which he was just fooling around, and he's thrown in chains and locked up. Many of the prophets wore those skins and things because it was the cheapest garments you could get, because it would just find an animal, tan the hide, and put it on as clothing. You could make it work for little to no expense. They all suffered, but they also waited. And I think most of them probably could have gotten out of their situations. Change the message. Don't be faithful to God. Stop challenging people. It was easy. Micaiah, especially as he stood before Ahab, I think if he had stuck to his guns and says, no, go ahead. God's with you. He really could have changed the outcome of his situation. Probably made a couple bucks, lived a better life, had nicer things, but he would have been compromising the message. And yet as we look at James again and consider this, he says, behold, we consider those blessed. Sorry, verse 11. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. How can you say that? Because that's what Jesus said. Matthew 5:11. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You have to play the long game, and that's what they were doing. They realized the benefits and the blessings and the things that God is promising come in the end. You have to get to the end, play the long game. They're not going to be found here on earth. And that brings us to our next individual, our next candidate, our next example, Job. Job, I think, is maybe the strangest person to find on this list. It's certainly not one we want to find. Nobody wants Job's life. Sure, it started out pretty good, and it ended really good. But that middle is awful. And even most of the prophets, they had their ups and downs, but their downs were rarely as down as Job's was. They had reprieve, and often, many times, they were able to commune with God. Even in the low times, many of them, several of them, had the opportunity. They were able to perform signs and wonders and miracles. They were able to do things. Job just suffers, and he gets no audience with God until the very end. Job perseveres through suffering. I don't know if I would call it patient, but it certainly is perseverance. But you have to understand, at the end of the day, Job was not being punished because of something he had done. In fact, God holds him up and talks to the accuser, the Satan, and looks like, have you considered my servant Job? He's held up as his example. It's not a punishment. And as Job was going through this and suffering, with no promise of a reward in the end, he often accused God of being unjust to him and demands an audience. Why is this my life? Yet as the first round of trials hit Job, we find in Job 1:22, in all this Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. He maintained his integrity. He refused to curse God and die. He didn't understand. He wondered why these things are happening to him, but he refused to curse God and die. And yet, for all the things that go on in Job's life, look at the last part of verse 11. How the Lord is compassionate and merciful. Of those words you would ever use in describing Job. That God was compassionate towards him and merciful to him. In the end, God does reveal himself to Job at the very end. But he never answers the question. Not the question that Job was asking. He simply shows Job his wisdom in the form of the universe. Have you considered Job? Here, these creatures. Have you considered Job? These constellations. Have you considered Job? This. And he just begins to show him the wonders and the beauty and the marvels of the universe that are around him. And Job sits there and he listens in stunned silence as God reveals to him his wisdom. And Job takes it all in. And he realizes how much bigger the world really is. And how complex the decisions that God makes every single second really are. He sits in silence at the wisdom of God. He still never understands why things were the way that they were. But from that moment forward, he can live in the peace and knowledge that it exists, that there are reasons. And then at the tail end of chapter 42, God gives him all his stuff back. And then some. Twice as much. I mean, it's crazy. But at the same time, it's not a reward for his work or his faithfulness in this. It's not a reward. Just like when God took it away, it wasn't a punishment. It's not a reward when he gets it all back. God, in his wisdom, took things away, and God, in his wisdom, gives them back. Christopher Ash, in his commentary on the book of Job, had this to say on James 5:11. He said, "The Lord is compassionate and merciful." How can James say that? And he gave three things here. He said, first of all, he is humbled as a person. Job is humbled as a person. We see that in Job chapter 42. You may want to turn there now if you want to. I have the verses behind me, some of them anyway, but you might want to look at them too and some of the broader context. But Job 42 verse 6 says this, "Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." It might sound cruel to say that Job was humbled by God, but that's truly the reality. He despised himself, and honestly, being a humble person is not a bad thing. It's really not. But Job realized at that moment, at the very end, that he was speaking about things that he ultimately knew nothing about, that God doesn't need to give him an answer. As much as he wanted one, God doesn't owe it to him. And for all of these things, he realized he overstated his case, and he despises himself for it. And now he wants to exalt God. He truly sees himself for who he is for the first time, and who God truly is for the first time now. And so he's a humble person, but he's also justified or accepted. Job 42, 7 and 8. After the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, "My anger burns against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken to me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now, therefore, take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and offer up a burnt offering for yourselves. And my servant Job shall pray for you. For I will accept his prayer, not to deal with you according to your folly. For you have not spoken to me what is right, as my servant Job has." You could say certainly that Job at this moment is verbally and openly and publicly being accepted by God. He is justified, declared to be a righteous person. Truly one of his people, and he had rightly spoken about God all throughout the book. Even when his three friends who pretended to be much more righteous, much more godly, and blaming Job, said, you must have done something wrong. God doesn't just do this on a whim. They didn't understand. And God tells them, he says, look, your three friends need to offer a sacrifice through you to me, and you can pray for them, and I'll hear your prayer. I won't listen to them, but I'll hear your prayer. He's a righteous and accepted man. And he prays now for his three friends. And he's also greatly blessed. Job 42:10. And the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends. And the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. He has given so much more than he ever had. Job finally knows what it means to enjoy and have a real celebration, real joy, real fruitfulness, to be able to see real beauty with the description we find it with his daughters, that they were more beautiful than any other. He finally understood that. You kind of get a glimpse here, an idea here, that Job in this moment, from this moment forward, enjoys something similar to what we might dare entertain as a concept of heaven. Not that it was that for him, but there's this massive turning point, and it's pointing us to something, that there's something greater, but you have to wait until the end. In this sense, I think Job really does function as a type. Not a type of Christ, per se, but as a type of us. Someone who is delivered and receives the joys of resurrection, receives the joys of having Christ, the heavenly rule of Christ. And when we follow God and realize he will not abandon us, but does in fact promise extravagant gifts and blessings to those who follow and persevere to the end. But you have to make it to the end. I think Job 42 has to be what James is thinking of when he describes this as being merciful and compassionate. It's not a reward. It is an extravagant gift. And we have to see it as a gift. As we draw this whole thing to a close, we understand specifically when it comes to Job, that Job bows down to God now, here right at the beginning of 42, the end of 41. Job bows down to God here now, not with all of the riches and wealth and the things that he had throughout life, but in pain, with nothing. He is blessed, but only after, not before this moment. And he falls down and he worships God without all this other stuff and without any promise of stuff. It's just simply like, who am I to question you? Who am I to challenge you? He doesn't even know it's really over, because his stuff is all still gone. His body is still very much broken, but he's finally gotten that audience with God. And God basically says, who are you to ask the question? And Job falls down and he worships. See, finally, for the first time, perhaps, at least that we get to see a little bit, that Job worshiped God because he is God. It's so easy for us or others outside of us sometimes, outside of our circles, but they follow God, but the question they're always asking is like, hey, what have you done for me lately? What can you give me? What can you do for me? You give me, and here's the deal. God says, I'll give you a good life, I'll give you a house, I'll give you health, I'll make your life just kind of like, not bad, but just kind of average. Okay, I can take that. Well, bow down and worship. God, what have you done for me lately? Job gets to the point in his life where he says, you have taken absolutely everything away from me, and I still bow down and I worship, because at the end of the day, I want God. Do you? Is that what you want more than anything else? God, you can strip me bare, and naked came I into this world, and naked will I go out, but I want God. That has to be our prayer. That has to be our place. And rarely, if ever, do we ever find ourselves in the shoes of Job where we can truly understand and say, that's what I would have said. Job is in that moment, in that position where he could truly say, I lived it. I lived it. Because I wanted God more than anything else. He was truly choosing God, not stuff. But until he got to that place, even Job wouldn't be able to tell you that's what he would say. James 5 is helping us understand the position that these believers are in. What do you really love? Because it is so easy to look at those who have so much more. They're abusing you and they're oppressing you and they're doing all those things with you. And rather than being patient and playing and allowing them to play by a different set of rules, we say, forget this. I want the stuff. I want the status. I want the prestige. I want the safety. I want the health. And we adopt those rules. And we follow and we do their thing and we forget Christianity because at the end of the day, we're looking at God and saying, what have you done for me lately? And we accuse God for doing wrong. God says, be patient. I'm coming. I'll be there soon. Thankfully, we get glimpses of the end all throughout life. Dare I say, none of us have ever really lived the life of Job. Thank God for that. We get glimpses of God's grace and His mercy here and now, sprinkled amongst the trials and the hardships and the difficulties and the things that we don't like. We do get that. We do. But God still says, be patient. Follow. You have to play the long game. You have to wait and make it to the end and see what I will do. Be patient. Persevere. Don't charge God with evil or with doing wrong. This isn't over yet. Be patient until the end. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for this day that you've graciously given. I'm thankful that as we've come together that we can appreciate and understand this particular passage that James is writing to us, especially when it comes to the story of Job. A story that, Lord, honestly, if we're probably curious at some times and at the same time we'll probably tremble in light of it. And yet we can learn from this that as he describes Job, or your relationship with Job is one of mercy and compassion. But as Job was faithful to the end, you blessed him greatly. And as we've said, Lord, it wasn't really a reward, it's an extravagant gift. A gift from one who truly and genuinely loved you. And Lord, there are echoes of that very same gift for every single one of us who are in Christ. That we make it to the end and we realize it truly will be glorious. The beauties of heaven, the celebrations of heaven, the lack of sorrow and frustration in heaven, all of those real joys and celebrations, the things we're longing for, the things that we think might just be possible this side of eternity, Lord, are reality in eternity. But we need to be patient. We need to be patient and not seek those things or long for those things here and now, but wait until the end. Lord, help us to be patient until the end, where we might see true beauty, true joy, and your face. In Christ's name, amen.